I have had a very hard time coming to terms with the fact that I wanted to do this episode. I probably sat down to record this at least 3 times over the last however many hours since the show came out last night. And it's never easy to address a rough topic. And the show, and Rick and Morty has never ever shied away from making stuff like that. So the fact that we're going to get into some controversial stuff, this is your spoiler warning. This is your warning. Not just because we're talking about a fun-loving show. It is a fun-loving show. But because it gets into some pretty hardcore subject matter. So, with that said, let's get into it. What's up, my know-it-alls? Okay, so clearly, disclaimer at the bottom, disclaimer at the top. We're ready to talk about this. I need you to understand, if you are of a certain age or if you are triggered by things like discussions of self-harm, discussions of people finishing up with all their living on their own terms, whatever this is you want to call it, it breaks down to reasons why you might need to call the hotline below. Okay? All right. With that out of the way, let's get into this episode. Rick and Morty's never ever shied away from commentating on things, and this episode is definitely a commentary, and it's not even a commentary on on the vehicle they're using. In fact, they're kind of riding several different rails when it comes to this episode. And on the one hand, this is a conversation about capitalism and the beast that we live in. Heck, the beast that you're in right now is a great example, which is people throwing themselves at this idea of, content creation and this and that, and please watch me, all for the sake of feeding this monster in the hopes of, garnering fame, a little bit of money, whatever, or whatever people think happens here. On here being YouTube. So what are some of the episodes I'm talking about? So let's go back to season 1, Me Seeks and Destroy, which is 2014's story having to do with a jelly bean king uncomfortably touching Morty. And it's very much one of those episodes that I remember when we first watched it years ago. We watched it during the pandemic. We were like, what just happened? Yeah, it was bad. You remember. And then of course, to the less controversial, but in some people's opinion, just as bad, Pickle Rick, where there's a ton of violence being talked about and addressed. A ton of violence. Like he overboard. They take like John Wick style violence to the extreme. Then, of course, there was season 4, episode 7, Primordius, where Rick and Morty make a joke about whether or not they pull off a 9/11. Again, the show has never veered away from controversial topics, and it's never ever in terms of allegory. So why should this episode be any different? In last night's episode, That's Amorte, it's the spaghetti episode. It's the one they've literally themed the entire season after. And I think that's also telling about some things. So in the episode, you start out, and I remember watching this clip, and I'm sure you all did too. It was extraordinarily uncomfortable, the level to which this clip was showing us just how much they loved. And then you get this crazy soylent green type veering off.
You gotta tell them silent breed is people!
Okay. And so immediately, Baby Know-It-All and I are like, oh, this is happening. And it goes there, man. So Morty finds out at the very end of the cold open, he finds out that by seeing Rick scooping spaghetti out of what looks like a body. Spoiler warning, it's a body. We then continue with Morty bothering Rick, trying to find out exactly where it's from, who's it about, because just in very Morty style fashion, if you remember a certain Snake Jazz, as Rick said in that episode, everything exists in space. Well, apparently there's a planet that when people choose to finish with all their living, because of something happens and he hand wave explains it away, their insides turn into spaghetti. Apparently, very tasty spaghetti. Stupid tasty spaghetti. Morty, of course, wanted to know more. He's like, well, can we know their faces? What's going on? And Rick's like, fine, I'll show you, introduce you to this and that. Takes them to the planet. First, they go to a morgue. And at the morgue, they find someone who has self-finished with all their living, and he cuts them open, and sure enough, it's spaghetti. And Morty's like, "Oh, I can't believe it! Why does it taste so good?" Because apparently it's really tasty stuff. Morty decides he has to go to the funeral. He wants to know their name, whatever else. And Rick's like, "Oh, spaghetti night's definitely over." Rick's so mad because he's like, "Well, clearly this is not going to go the way we all think it will, and this is stupid." They've kind of broken up the season into a couple of different chunks. And the first 3 episodes were really focusing on Rick, I believe, and sort of his journey. Rick through therapy, Rick dealing with trust issues, setting boundaries, the whole 9 yards. So now we come into Morty, and in very Rick fashion, Rick loves, delights, and joys in making Morty regret or see just how bad some of his decisions, because Morty's definitely a no good deed goes unpunished type person. I think we all can agree with that. So what inevitably ends up happening is Morty gets a call back. Oh, the family finally gets told. And the thing is, the family has to tiptoe around the fact that they kind of don't care because it was the best spaghetti they'd ever had in their lives. So what happens? The planet contacts Morty. They send a ship for him. They bring him home. The president of the planet sits here and says, "Okay, so walk me through this." And so what they do is they get someone on video. The person's apparently dying of something pretty gruesome. And they're like, she's like, "The one thing, I have nobody. And if I could just be... if I would just love to be delicious before I whatever." So that's when, so Morty's like, "Okay, well, I guess that kind of works." And so he brings dinner home again and explains it's ethical spaghetti, Morty. Okay, that's really what this is. It's ethical spaghetti. And so while they're there, all of a sudden they get Rick walks in and puts a can on the table. Morty has effectively collapsed the society. Because apparently, once the information came out that they could make money doing this, the entire planet decided to continue doing this and start selling as a commodity spaghetti. That's all I have to say anymore. So they start selling spaghetti around the entire galaxy, but now the problem is they're running out of people. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So Rick takes Morty back to that planet, and sure enough, the entire planet has gone into a state of disarray. People are like, it's unbelievably depressing. And they're trying to figure out all kinds of different ways. So what does Morty do? Of course, Morty asks Rick to go ahead and invent. He's like, "Well, can you make up something like this and that?" And the one thing Rick does best is come up with morally ambiguous solutions. And by the way, just Rick entertaining this entire series of events is genuinely growth for him. And you'll see why in a second. As they go through these events, process after process after process fails. Rick at one point is like,
"Oh, geez. Oh, no, Rick."
So I didn't even bother to make it because I knew you'd take issue.
So what does he do? He ends up coming up with this crazy solution, and it's just weird. And so finally, the end solution is there's one last person, and they can try to convince. So maybe Rick can synthesize the spaghetti. So what does he do? He takes in charge of every single screen everywhere on the planet, in space, everybody there, because there's a line of spaceships waiting to pick up their spaghetti and deliver it. And sure enough, that moment...
I'm in pain, and I wish I could die. But I won't feed your sick system of profit. Integrity means living with pain.
Is literally the crux of this episode, okay? I believe that's entirely what this episode hangs on. So then Rick does something very uncharacteristic. He shows them their life, this guy's life. And he says, "This is the last person's gonna have to die. Everyone's gonna get their spaghetti. It's not gonna be a problem, but here first, this." And sure enough, he shows them their entire life. Rick makes them appreciate the fact that this is not just a commodity. It isn't just food. It's a person. And that's what makes this whole thing crazy. Because at that point, everyone gets revolted. Morty very astutely points out, and actually, Baby Know-It-All pointed it out too, almost instantly before the show did. Rick could not make the spaghetti taste bad, but he could make it distasteful. And I thought that was brilliant. I thought it was a really good approach. I thought they handled it very well. The episode's probably going to be triggering to some people, so be careful, watch with caution. And again, we don't normally cover stuff this controversial, and I'm literally sitting here watching the show like, I'm enjoying the heck out of it, but I'm like, I have no idea how I'm going to talk about this on my show. So I really hope I did a sensitive job. I need you guys to understand, I feel very uncomfortable talking about this. However, I talked to someone very close to me who has dealt with self-harm ideation thoughts. And the one thing they said was, hey man, I've had to deal with that in the past. And at the end of the day, I love this episode. I thought they felt seen, and I think that's great. So if that, there you go. Now you know. And if knowing's half the battle, you're halfway to being a know-it-all yourself. What's the know-it-all index set for this episode? This was a really good episode. I'm giving it a 9. It was good. I enjoyed it. Comment below. Keep it respectful and let's not be distasteful. But I'd love to hear what you guys thought of the episode. Did it trigger anything for you? Was it just was it Rick and Morty as usual? I know for me, it felt a lot like Rick and Morty as usual. If you're in the comment section talking about how Rick and Morty's lost their bite, whoo! Welcome to the new version of the top 10 list of various episodes that some people might be offended by. All right, guys, comment below. We'll talk soon. Never forget, everyone loves a know-it-all. Hey guys, Mr. Know-It-All here. Do me a big favor. If you're feeling thoughts of self-harm or things of that nature, or any kind of depression or some sort of you have thoughts that feel like they may or may not be, they may be questionable, do me a favor, please. Take the time. Call the number on the screen. People care, especially if you're part of the Know-It-All Nation. I want you to know I care, which sounds crazy, but I do. I would much rather you call this number rather than liking or even subscribing to my channel. What's more important to me than all the numbers and all the stuff is you. So thank you again for being a part of the Know-It-All Nation. Please know you are appreciated. All right, guys, I'll talk to you soon.